Oh, hey, as we kick off our conversation this morning, I gotta admit maybe a little bit. I am a chronic mountain maker, especially in the context of marriage. Anybody else feel like you're the mountain maker in your marriage? I feel like every marriage has one mountain maker, and I am definitely the mountain maker. And I was thinking about this week. There was a moment. Oh, it was about probably 4 or 5 years ago. Where Emily and I got into a conversation. I honestly really tried to remember what it was about. I could not remember what it was about because it wasn't that big of a deal, right? But we got into this conversation, and it turned into an argument, and I just was like, I was so passionate and so sure and so right, you know? And I'm just like defending this to the nth degree. And we're going back and forth, and I don't know what happened. But somehow in the conversation, I just remember getting deeply offended. Now, it doesn't mean that she said something offensive. It just means that I got offended, which is typically how it goes. I mean, if you know my wife, she's the least offensive person in the world. And if you know me, I'm probably one of the more offendable people in the world, okay? So, like, I found a way. It was almost like I was working and trying to get offended in the moment, but I found a way to get offended. And I'm going to tell myself, okay? I did something in that moment that I rarely do. It's the only time I actually can remember in the course of our 12 years of marriage. It's the only time I can remember doing this, okay? I left the house, which is a really great idea in marriage and argument, right? Just to walk. But I walked out of the house, and I walked straight to the car. Actually, went to her car. I don't even remember why I took her car, but I took her car. I don't know, maybe I was feeling chippy. And I got in her car, and I just sped out, and I left. And to be fully transparent this morning, I left, and I went to see another woman. Her name is Wendy, and she makes really good hamburgers. You know, the ones with the square patties, not the round patties? And I went, and I ordered myself a junior bacon cheeseburger and a $1 meal fry or whatever, you know. And I sat at the table for a while, finished my meal, and I sat there until I realized what an idiot that I was. Now, what I did in that moment, quite honestly, is the thing that I find most of us do in some way, shape, or form when we find ourselves offended or offendable, or we find ourselves experiencing some level of pain, whether it's valid or whether it's not. The reality is our natural pain response in relationships is to begin to create distance from our perceived source of the pain, to separate ourselves from them, to move away from them, whether that be physically or just emotionally. But to create space there. And we actually believe that the distance creates safety in relationships, don't we? We convince ourselves that the further we go, the safer we become. And sometimes that's true, right? Like there are some moments and some situations and some people where you need to create clear boundaries and lots of distance, moments of active and continual harm in your life that you need to protect yourself from. And also there are times where distance actually doesn't create safety, but instead where distance actually leaves us more vulnerable. And that's what we're going to discover this morning. Now, this morning, we're jumping into part 2 of a series that we started last week that we're calling Same Old Ship. And it's a conversation that we're having about a moment or a period of time in the Apostle Paul's life, when the Apostle Paul found himself stuck on the same old ship for much longer than he was supposed to be because of the mistakes and the decisions of other people in his life that did damage to him. Now, to catch you up, if you weren't here last week, I'll give you the Cliff Notes version. You can go back and watch. But to catch you up real quick, the Apostle Paul was one of the earliest leaders within the Christian movement. And he would go around city after city after city, sharing the good news about Jesus and establishing local churches in those communities. And then he made the decision later in his life to go back to Jerusalem and teach the good news. Now Jerusalem was the epicenter of Jewish culture. I mean, it's a religious hotbed, even just as much as it is today. But he goes back anyway into this very Jewish society to teach a Christian lesson and story and perspective. And when he does, it's so upsetting and so unraveling in that city that it starts a riot, and he finds himself at the very middle of that riot. And because he kind of had something to do with inciting the riot, he himself was arrested. Now, he was taken to Caesarea, and he was put on trial in front of a king. And the king asked him if he wanted to go be tried in Jerusalem. And Paul was like, I don't want to go to Jerusalem. They'll kill me if you take me back to Jerusalem. And so Paul, being a citizen of the Roman Empire, appealed to Caesar, which was his right as a citizen. When he appeals to Caesar, what he's basically saying is, I demand that my case be transferred to the city of Rome and tried by the courts there. Now, the king at this point, it's out of his hands. It's Paul's right to do. And so the king basically puts Paul on a prisoner transport of him and other prisoners, overseen by a small force of soldiers, to go to Rome. They board a ship in Caesarea. They begin crossing the Mediterranean Sea. And as they're crossing the Mediterranean Sea, they encounter strong headwinds, stronger than they were anticipating, that slow their ship down. They end up porting temporarily in this port called Fair Havens. Fair Havens, it was this place where they could go and kind of restock supplies, get what they need to continue the journey ahead. And they were planning on going ahead, but the challenge again is that they had hit these headwinds. It had slowed them down, and winter was coming. And in this part of the world, when winter would come, more bad, like worse and worse storms would come as well, storms that were potentially dangerous to the ship. But Fair Havens wasn't a good harbor to spend the winter in. Fair Havens was what was known as an exposed harbor. Basically, it was more open to the elements, and so if the ship stayed there, it ran the chance of being damaged by the elements as the winter storms came in. And so a lot of the crew was talking about moving ahead and going to a different port, but Paul, kind of looking around and taking in the situation, had a different perspective. And in fact, we get a glimpse into Paul's perspective through the author of Acts, who basically takes these journal entries that were written by someone who traveled with Paul and captured what was happening in real time. And we get this journal entry in the book of Acts that tells us that Paul actually had a different response and different perspective of the situation than the people around him. And in fact, Paul says to the crew of the ship, he says, "Men, I believe there is trouble ahead if we go on." He said, because we're talking about shipwreck, loss of cargo, and danger to our lives as well. Guys, I'm looking at the situation here. I'm seeing what's happened. I know we want to press forward. I know we wanted to be further than we are right now. But situations that were out of our control have kept us from moving at the speed that we had planned on. But we need to take that into account and just recognize the situation for what it is. And it looks to me like things are going to get worse. And if we don't stop now, we're going to have problems. Our journaler tells us, though, that the officer in charge of the prisoners listened more to the ship's captain and the owner than to Paul. So Paul has this perspective, but man, the captain and the owner of the ship have more influence. We said this last week. We said that being right doesn't always come with having rights. Right? You can be right, but it doesn't often come with the rights that you would hope for to be able to enforce your opinions and perspectives, maybe even your rightness on the people around you. And so Paul, in many ways, is right, but he doesn't have any rights. And the ship's captain, the officer in charge, looks at the ship's captain and the owner for a decision. And they said that since Fair Haven was an exposed harbor, a poor place to spend the winter, most of the crew wanted to go on to Phoenix, farther up the coast of Crete, and spend the winter there. Now, I'd love to spend the winter in Phoenix, but we're not talking about that Phoenix, right? We're talking about the Phoenix that's on the island of Crete, just a little bit further west than Fair Havens. And most of them say, hey, let's just go for it. Let's give it a shot. We think we can make it. If you keep reading as we did last week, what you find is the storm did come. It was the kind of storm that blew them off the coast of Crete and out into open waters, into a place where they actually lost sight of where they were and what was going on, where they spent about 2 weeks at the least, trying to just keep this ship together. I mean, they bound it with ropes. They threw cargo overboard, trying to just lighten the load. They did everything that they could. The author of Acts even tells us that the clouds were so thick that for 2 weeks they couldn't see the sun, the moon, the stars. So all of their navigational systems were gone at that point. And they had no clue where they were. As we said last week, Paul finds himself in this situation, right? We said last week that their ship became Paul's problem. I'm willing to bet that at some point in your life, maybe very recently or maybe quite a while ago, but at some point, I'm willing to bet that somebody else's ship has become your problem as well. Maybe for you as a boss at work, a boss who has the right to make decisions but not the wisdom to make decisions. And everything that he or she does, you just roll your eyes at it and go, I'm going to have to clean this one up too. I'm going to have to fix this one again. I'm going to have to put this one back together. And just everywhere he or she goes, they're just creating problems for you to solve. Maybe for you, it's a coworker like that. Maybe for you, it's a family member who you find yourself kind of tethered to because of the relational ties that exist. And yet they keep creating problems that have downstream consequences that affect you, maybe affect you financially or relationally, or just create more drama that you have to deal with. And you're just sick of the group chat and the ways that they chime in. Others of us, maybe it's a friend who backstabbed you, betrayed you, walked out on you, maybe a friend who changed at some point, and when you met them and established a friendship with them, they were one person, but the way you look at their life now, you go, you're not even the person I met. And now you're dealing with the consequences of their decisions and also the pain that comes from watching someone shift the way that they live and shift the way that they relate to you. And all of us at some point or another have had a situation where someone else's ship became our problem. And Paul's in that situation, and now Paul's stuck on their ship. But it's just as much his problem. Now, our journaler, right, the one writing in this journal, capturing all of these moments for us, if you keep reading, he tells us about this moment that happened while they're out on the water in the middle of a storm. And it's a moment, quite honestly, that when you first read it, it's so small, it only takes a couple of lines in the book of Acts. It's so small that you might gloss over it, but in fact, it's got great wisdom for us as we try to navigate our own storms in life. He says this, he says it about midnight on the 14th night of the storm. As we were being driven across the Sea of Adria, the sailors sensed that land was near. They started to get the idea that maybe land was getting closer than it had been before, and so they want to test this theory. They dropped a weighted line and found that the water was 120 feet deep. So they literally would just take a thick weight, tie it to the end of a rope, and just drop it into the water until they found the bottom, and they would measure how much rope they had dropped. But a little bit later, they measured again and found that it was only 90 feet deep. So the water is getting less and less deep, which means they are most likely getting closer and closer to land. He tells us that at this rate, they were afraid that we would soon be driven against the rocks along the shore. So they drew out 4 anchors from the back of the ship and prayed for daylight, which is a great Rascal Flatts song, by the way. Just saying. Some of you don't even know who Rascal Flatts is, which is a problem, and we're going to talk about that later, okay? Now, here's the thing, all right? They start to recognize that they're getting closer and closer to land, or they're pretty sure that they're getting closer and closer to land. And they're starting to worry that if they get too close to land, they're going to find rocks on the bottom of the ocean, because this isn't necessarily a harbor. This isn't necessarily a place they would port. And so they're afraid of running aground on rocks on the bottom of the sea floor and being stranded now out too far from land to be able to get in. And so now the sailors, the ones who got Paul into this mess to begin with, they start to get a little bit devious in the way that they act. The author tells us that the sailors tried to abandon the ship. Watch what they did. They lowered the lifeboat as though they were going to put out anchors from the front of the ship. So they pretend like, okay, we've dropped anchors on the back of the ship. They start pretending like they're now going to drop anchors off the front of the ship, except instead of just dropping anchors off the front of the ship, they just start lowering the lifeboat, and they're planning to escape. Now, the lifeboat's obviously much smaller than the ship, and the lifeboat can only handle so many people. And so they can't take everybody with them. And so they're trying to trick everybody into thinking that they're just doing one thing when they're actually trying to get out before anyone else notices that they were trying to get out. And Paul catches on to what's happening in this moment. And the author tells us that Paul said to the commanding officer and the soldiers, he looks at them and he says, hey, you guys, you all die unless the sailors stay aboard. Look, we need these guys. Look, I mean, I know their decisions got us here, but these guys also have a set of skills that we need if we're ever going to get ourselves out of here. He says, if they get out, we don't have a chance. And so the soldiers cut the ropes to the lifeboat and let it drift away, essentially stranding the sailors on the ship and saying, you're not going till we can go, and we need you to get out of this. Now, let's talk for a second real quick about our common responses to people who get us into situations that we never wanted to be in. I mean, many of us in a situation like this would look at the sailors or look at whoever that is in your life and go, thank God you're finally leaving. Like, it's about time you got out of this ship. You've been in this thing for way too long. I'm ready for you to go. I'll figure this out on my own. You obviously don't know enough about what you're doing. I can figure it out. But Paul recognizes something different in this moment. Paul looks at them with all of the, you got me into this thing, this is your fault. If you had just listened to me back in Fair Havens, we wouldn't be here. Can you believe what you've done? Paul looks at them with all of that and all of the validity of all of that, and also recognizes that I still need you. I'm going to get out of this. What Paul knew to be true, quite honestly, is true for me. It's true for you. It's this, that God can use an imperfect crew to rescue you. Even the dumb ones. Okay? I mean it. Even the ones who created problems for you. Even the ones who got you in the storm in the first place. Even the ones who created all of the consequences that you're experiencing right now. Now, let me be clear. There are seasons where someone is an active danger to you and an active source of harm for you, where you need to create boundaries and distance from them. Okay? But there are also moments where the consequences that you're living with today are because of the past decisions that someone else made, but not the present circumstance that they're living in. And yet our response to them so often is still to go, look, you got me into this ship. I didn't choose this ship. This wasn't my ship in the first place. But now I got to get out of this ship. And the last thing I want is you in this ship with me still after you created it. And what we do so often is we create distance from the very people who we might actually need to move forward and the people that God might actually choose to use to get us out of the mess that we find ourselves in. And what we find ourselves left with is trying to navigate the storms of life as a one-man crew. Now, the number one reason that we find ourselves sometimes living life as a one-man crew is because of the ways that we've been hurt by the people who were close to us in the past. Now, let me explain this. When I talk about going through life as a one-man crew, I don't mean you don't have any friends, okay? Many of us have a lot of friends. This is different. Many of us have a lot of what I would call deck friends. You know what a deck friend is in life? A deck friend is somebody who sits at the kind of top part of your life, and you guys can hang out, and you guys can fish together, and you can suntan together, and you can go swimming together, and you can throw a football together, right? And you could talk about sports together, you could chop it up together, right? But the deepest parts of you, the parts of your life that you're afraid of, or experience fear, the pieces of you that worry, the dreams that you actually have for your life, the things that concern you, the things that keep you up at night, the hurt that you've experienced in the past. Ooh, nobody sees that part of your ship. Nobody is let down into that space. I mean, they can hang out at the top, but Mo, you want to talk about the real stuff? You want to talk about where I came from? You want to talk about what I've experienced? You want to talk about what I worry about? You want to talk about what makes me anxious? We hold those people back from those parts of our lives. And then when the storms of life comes and everybody clears the deck, we find ourselves living as a one-man crew. They're not talking about friendship. Many of us live with a lot of friends, and yet nobody knows the deepest parts of our life. And so when the deepest seasons of life come, there's nobody there to walk it with us. Now, if we're going to talk about what it looks like to build a crew, there's two things we've got to talk about. If we're going to build a crew, we've got to talk about trust, and we have to talk about forgiveness. And really, forgiveness paves the way for trust. Let's talk about trust in a way that's going to lead us to forgiveness, okay? So when we talk about trust, there's this framework that I came across recently. There's a guy named Dave Willis. He's a pastor and a relational coach, specifically in the context of marriage. But I think so much of what he teaches about marriage has an application across all of our relationships. When he talks about trust, he talks about the 5 stages of trust. The 5 stages of trust look like this. I'm going to give these to you quickly. We're going to focus on the top 3, but all 5 are helpful. Okay, he says the first stage of trust is connection. It's just establishing a connection with somebody based on something that you have in common, right? Maybe we like the same football team. Maybe we like the same food. Maybe we're wearing the same color shirt. Whatever it is, there's a connection point at the very beginning that just comes from something simple and common, okay? The next stage of relationships is caution, right? This is where we start creating opportunities to see the other person's character, but we're also hesitant to let them into the deepest parts of our life. And so we want to get to know them a little bit more and see if they're trustworthy. We also don't want to be hurt by them. So we're kind of in this middle in-between stage. Now, the third phase, if we go past that, right, is what consistency. Okay, this is where we actually create consistent opportunities to see their character, consistent opportunities for them to see our character, and to start to establish a pattern of their character to discern who they are. The next stage, the fourth stage, is courage. This is where we actually begin to take steps of vulnerability and trust them, which leads to the fifth stage of commitment, which is kind of the I'm with you thick or thin stage. Whatever the storm of your life is, I'm there for it. Whatever you need, just I'm a call away. That's commitment, okay? Now, the reality is most of us long for commitment. We want to live in stage 5, but we're not willing to go to the first 4 stages. Let me give you an example of how this works, okay? A couple of years ago, my family was at the airport. And it's an early morning, it's actually a Christmas morning flight, and it's an early flight. So everybody's tired, everybody's groggy. We get to the airport, and one of the first things that I do is I go and find just like a good breakfast sandwich. I don't know what it is about an airport breakfast sandwich, but this tastes a little bit better at the airport. I don't know why. So I go get an airport breakfast sandwich, and the place I find it is at the opposite end of the concourse from where our plane is taking off. So I find the sandwich, I walk back to where our plane is going to be boarding in a little bit, and I'm hanging out there eating my sandwich. My wife and my daughter go to the restroom. I'm there by myself. There's a guy standing next to me who's sitting there. He's by himself, and I notice he's got this huge duffel bag, just giant bag. And he looks at my sandwich. He's like, man, that looks like a good sandwich. I was like, yeah, man, they make them really good down there, blah, blah, blah. This is where it's at. And we're just kind of chatting for a few minutes. And about 3 minutes into the conversation, he looks at me and goes, hey, I think I'm going to go get me one of those sandwiches. Would you mind to watch my bag while I go to the other end of the concourse and grab one of those sandwiches? Now, in this moment for me, alarms start going off, you know? I'm like, dude, I don't know if you've ever been to an airport before. You can pretty much do almost anything you want at the airport, you know? You can run the hallways. You can sleep wherever you want. You can even watch a movie on your phone without headphones. Everybody's going to hate you, but you can do it, okay? But I'm like, they got one rule at the airport. You know what it is? And they say, like, every 5 minutes they come on the speakers just to make sure you know. Do not watch a stranger's bag, you know? And then after that, they say, if you see something, say something. And I'm like, I don't know, but I think I'm seeing something right now, you know? And so I look at this man as I'm eating my sandwich, and I go, nah, man, I can't do that. And so he gets up, and I watch this man carry the largest duffel bag I've ever seen down to the opposite end of the concourse to get a breakfast sandwich. In the meantime, my wife and kids come back. And I come back, I look at Emily with our daughter and say, hey, there's a guy who's going to come back in a few minutes. He's got a black baseball cap, a brown shirt. Watch him. And I'm like on him like a hawk. I'm like, I don't know, man. Like, I don't know what's going on. This seems weird. Shouldn't ask me to watch his bag. I watched like where he stood in the line to board the plane. I got on the plane. I watched him come in and make note of where he was sitting. That dude got up to use the bathroom. I knew it. You know what I mean? Like, I was on him the whole way. Now, the reality is we had a little bit of connection, right, over a breakfast sandwich. And then from that moment forward, our relationship was stuck in caution. And there was no way that we were going to move past that, okay? Now, here's the reality I hope that many of us will latch onto today, okay? For many of us, we have spent most of our relationships stuck in caution, hoping for further commitment, but afraid of actually taking the steps that might just lead us to commitment. And here's what we do at times, too. We actually, when a relationship starts to move towards consistency and courage, some of us, we actually start to sabotage our relationships. And so a dating relationship is going great, but the moment that it starts to get a little bit serious, we find something wrong with him or her that everyone else goes, that seems like a really small thing. And we go, no, I'm pretty sure. Warning, warning, warning. I think this is a problem. Or we have friendships. We start with people. We start having these relationships with people. But the moment they want to start hanging out consistently, or the moment that they open up about their life, we go, warning, warning, warning. I don't want to move towards that. I don't want to move towards vulnerability. Or some of us, we show up to dinner parties every other week. And we show up to a dinner party, and we're there to connect. But, man, we sit back on the sidelines, and I'm not sharing anything about the deepest parts of my life with these people. I want their commitment, but I'm not willing to move through my caution. Now hear me. For most of us, and you might be the exception, but for most of us, the reason your present relationships are stuck in caution is because of unforgiveness in your past relationships. Let's say that again. The reason your present relationships are stuck in caution is because of unforgiveness that still exists in your past relationships. To put it more simply, we could say it like this: past unforgiveness prevents present trust. And so because as life naturally goes, we've experienced hurt and pain in our past relationships, we find ourselves afraid to open ourselves up to new relationships. And we say, stuck in caution, warning, warning, watch out, don't trust, be careful, don't get hurt again, over and over again. And what we'll say is things like, I'd love to hang out, I just don't have enough time for that. And the reality is, we're actually living with the fear of being hurt again. Can we take this one layer deeper? And maybe this is just true for me, but I think it's probably true for some of us as well. One of the primary reasons we don't want to forgive someone, one of the primary reasons we hold on to unforgiveness in past relationships, because we're afraid that if we forgive them, it's as if we're saying that what they did in the past was actually okay. That if I actually heal from this, it might diminish the scope and the size of what they did. And here's the narrative that we live with. We never say this out loud, but this is the narrative that we live with in the deepest parts of ourselves. We say, my wound is the proof of their wrongdoing, right? Like my pain and my hurt is the evidence of what they did. And if I move past my pain and my hurt, if I actually offer forgiveness to them, it is as if I'm suggesting that what they did was not that big of a deal. And so I've got to hold on to the proof of their wrongdoing, which is my pain. I've got to hold on to the receipts for the decisions that they made. When Emily and I got married, and we moved states at the same time. And then we moved in for the first time, moved in together, this little apartment. And when I moved first, a couple months later, she moved in, and we're unboxing all of her stuff. And as we're unloading all of her stuff, one of the things that we came across, or that I came across, I guess she knew it was there, I basically kind of found this box that was full of shoe boxes. And inside each of those shoe boxes was just stacks and stacks and stacks of receipts. They went all the way back to like when she was in college. I mean, we're talking like 8 years of receipts at this point. Every transaction that she had made, every cup of coffee, every donut, every lunch, every shirt, every trip to Target, every single thing that she'd ever purchased is a receipt for. And I'm like, you got problems with the IRS? Like, we need to talk about this. Like when you possibly going to need to prove that you bought that coffee in 2007, you know? But she has stacks and stacks and stacks of receipts. Listen, some of us have been storing the receipts of our past relationships for a really long time. And we've been holding on to them as if we've got to prove that what they did was wrong. And all it's doing is holding you back from being able to trust other people in your life who just might journey life with you again. There's this moment in the life of Jesus that I love. This moment where Peter, who has been following Jesus for years, has seen Jesus love like no one else has ever loved and offer compassion like no one else has ever offered compassion. He comes to Jesus and he asks a question that honestly is a question we've probably never asked out loud, but it's a question we've asked before. He says, Lord, how often should I forgive someone who sins against me? And then Peter goes out on a limb. You know, he's like, let me see if I can answer my own question. He goes, 7 times? Feel good, you know? Now, you got to understand, in Jewish culture, the number 7 is the number of completion. So this seems like 7 would just like complete the process. We'd be good, right, Jesus? Jesus looks back at Peter. I imagine he kind of smirked a little bit. He says, no, not 7 times, but 70 times 7. And then, this is the best part, and then Jesus, in like typical Jesus fashion, it's like the most Jesus thing that Jesus does, Jesus begins to tell Peter a story. It's a story that Peter didn't ask for. In fact, I can imagine that Peter, when Jesus starts into a story, Peter kind of being like, Jesus, oh, dude, I can do math. I got it. We're good. I think Jesus, if he'd asked, would probably have looked at Peter and just said, listen, you're asking a question about behavior, but I want to give you an answer about your heart. And the only way I'm going to get to your heart is through story. So Jesus tells Peter the story. The story goes like this. He says to Peter, there was a king one time who had a number of servants. And this king had lent money to many of his servants, allowed them to borrow money. And then one day the king decided that it was time for his servants to pay him back for the loan that he'd given them. And so the king calls in the first servant. And this first servant owed the king millions of dollars. And the king demands, he says, hey, it's time to pay back your loan. And the first servant, he doesn't have the money. And the king says, well, look, it's time then for you to be sold into slavery along with your family to pay back the debt that you owe me. And the first servant obviously is blown away by this and overcome by this. And so he just begins to plead with the king, would you please give me more time? Would you please give me another opportunity? The king looks at the man, he has pity on the man. And instead of giving him more time, he just forgives his debt. Now, this first servant is so excited that his debt, millions of dollars, has just been forgiven, and he leaves. And his next move is to begin to go to servants who owe him money, because he had lent money to other people as well. And so the first servant goes to a second servant and calls in the second servant, and first servant to the second servant says, hey, you remember those thousands of dollars that I lent you? It's time for you to pay that back. Now, the second servant doesn't have the money to pay the first servant. And so he begins to beg with the first servant, would you please give me more time? Would you please give me more time? Would you please give me more time? And the first servant's not willing to give him more time. In fact, he does something else. And watch what Jesus does in this moment. This is a story that Jesus is creating for Peter to get to Peter's heart and to make a point to Peter. And what Jesus does in this next moment, oh gosh, it's so brilliant. It's so smart. Look at what Jesus says about the first servant. He says the first servant had the man, this being the second servant, arrested and put in prison until the debt could be paid in full. Now, this isn't an accident, right? But there's a problem here. Because he's demanding that the debt be paid and also putting him in prison at the same time. And here's the challenge. You can't work in prison. And so he's looking at the man, he's demanding that he be paid back, and he's simultaneously removing the opportunity for him to pay him back. He's saying, hey, pay me back, but I'm not going to let you pay me back. Hey, you need to fix this, but I'm not going to give you the chance to fix this. Hey, you need to put the pieces back together, but I'm not going to give you the opportunity to put the pieces back together. And listen, don't miss this. He receives no more by putting the man in prison than he would have if he had just forgiven the debt. Now, the king in Jesus' story, the king hears about this. And you can start to imagine the king's response to this. And the king calls that first servant back to him, and he says to that first servant, you evil servant, I forgave you that tremendous debt because you pleaded with me. Shouldn't you have mercy on your fellow servant just as I had mercy on you? Jesus says, then the angry king sent the man to prison to be tortured until he had paid his entire debt. Then after telling this story, I imagine Jesus looks right back squarely at Peter and looks him in the eyes. This is Peter who is hearing this story for the first time, but would tell this story later through the lens of having seen his own king crucified. And Jesus looks back at Peter and he says these words. And honestly, if you're a follower of Jesus, these words should pierce your heart. He says, that's what my heavenly Father will do to you if you refuse to forgive your brothers and sisters from your heart. Here's the point in all this. For the follower of Jesus, your heavenly Father already went to the greatest of lengths to pay back your debts or to relieve you of them. Except instead of paying it back in money, he paid it through the life of your king, his son. Be paid off all of the debts created by our sins and our mistakes and our wrongdoings and our moments of guilt and our moments of shame. And when we turn away from that and refuse to forgive the people who have done damage to us in our past, it is an affront to what our King has already done for us. And it is evidence that we do not fully comprehend the gravity of the gospel. And when we live that way, listen, we create a barrier between us and our relationship with God. And we create barriers between us and our relationships with other people. And so, really, we only have two paths. We can either choose unforgiveness and stay in unforgiveness in our past relationships. That doesn't just affect our past relationships, but leads us to distrust people in our present relationships and will leave you trying to navigate the storms of life as a one-man crew. Navigating life on your own, trying to work through the storms of life on your own, trying to work through the consequences of other people's decisions on your own. Living life with a lot of deck friends, but no actual crewmates to live the deepest parts of life with you. Or we can follow the example of our King and choose forgiveness in our past relationships, which opens the door for us to trust in our present relationships, not the kind of trust that says, I trust that you're never going to hurt me. The kind of trust that says, I trust that I'm going to be okay, even if you do. And when we live that way, we open the door to navigate life with an imperfect crew. A crew of people who are going to make mistakes, who are going to mess things up. A crew of people whose consequences you're going to experience as well at times. A crew of people you're probably going to have to forgive again and again. But a crew of people that God can use to navigate the storms of life with you. Because if what was true for Paul is true for me and true for you, then God can use an imperfect crew to rescue you. Say this last part with me. Because the truth is, hear me, the truth is, in one shape or form, we are all one of the dumb ones. And you can put me and my junior bacon cheeseburger at the top of that list, okay? Let me pray for you before we go. Jesus, I thank you for the ways that you have modeled this for us in ways that we could have never imagined and never foreseen and never chosen and never predicted. And yet so many of us in this room have experienced it. Thank you for the forgiveness that you have opened up to us and made available to us. God, for the person in this room this morning who has never experienced that, who has never lived from the posture of eternally forgiven, God, would they begin to understand the depth of just what you did for us when you gave your life for us, to pave a way for us to have a relationship with God. God, for those of us who have lived with that forgiveness, but maybe haven't turned around and given that away to others just as freely as it was given to us, God, would today be the day that we begin to shred the receipts? Would today be the day that we begin to move on and allow ourselves to heal? Would today be the day that we forgive? Not in a way that says that what they did was okay, but in a way that says that what you've done for us is enough for us. And we are okay, despite what they did. God, for those of us who find ourselves trying to navigate the storms of life on our own, would you open us up to be able to engage relationships from a position of trust that allows them to grow and develop? God, we make decisions today that set us up to build relationships, true relationships, not just light friendships, but true relationships that we can do life with and navigate storms with. God, would we look back a year from now and see the impact on our relationships from decisions that we made today? Would you give us the courage to move forward with the things that we've heard? It's in Christ's name we pray. Amen.